everyone. Welcome back. Today we're looking at energy movement and how it flows through ecosystems. So we're going to go a little bit more in depth about different roles that organisms can have in an ecosystem. We're going to look at food chains and food webs again. I know we looked at that a little bit, but a little bit more in depth. So let's get to it. Let's get started. Okay, so first of all, when we refer to energy flows, we're going to start talking about something referred to as a trophic level. Okay, so a trophic level is essentially like a categorization to talk about how living things are able to get their energy. So for example, the way that plants get their energy is very different from the way that a fish would get its energy, or very different from the way that a lion would get its energy, right? So every type of organism fits into a specific trophic level. So let's talk about what types of categorizations we have for organisms, and then we'll look at trophic levels that they belong to. So first of all, there are two main categories that living things can fall under. One is an autotroph and one is a heterotroph. Okay, so in a nutshell, an autotroph is something that can make its own food. So for example, plants. A heterotroph is something that has to ingest its food. Okay, so we are an example of a heterotroph. Basically anything other than autotrophs fall under heterotroph category. So autotrophs. So autotrophs are organisms that can make their own food from basic nutrients such as light from the sun, water, and carbon dioxide. Okay, so another term, and you may have looked at this in elementary school, but another term that autotrophs fall under is a producer. So when you say something is a producer, we're indicating that it produces its own food or its own nutrients. So producer and autotroph mean exactly the same thing. So in terms of trophic level, producers always are in the same trophic level all the time. They never change. They are in the first trophic level. So any food web or food chain that we're going to look at, you have to first start with the trophic level at the beginning, which is the producer trophic level. So plants, algae, trees, flowers, any sort of organism that can grow from not ingesting its food by basically using sunlight and products that are in the air or in the soil, those are producers. So there are another type of producers that we don't really talk about often because they're not seen or looked at as much in food chains and food webs. But those are organisms that can do chemical reactions to make their food. So not a lot of organisms can do that. So different types of bacteria can create their own food. So they're also autotrophs, but I'll be honest, it's only certain types. So it's not all bacteria can fall under this. Most bacteria actually are consumers. So it just so happens to be that there are some that can do that. So we call those chemosynthetic organisms. So think of like chemo as like chemicals, right? So it does a chemical reaction to make their own food. Okay, most autotrophs fall under this category. So photosynthetic organisms. So meaning organisms that will do photosynthesis in order to make their own food. And we're going to spend next week, we'll look at photosynthesis a little bit more in depth. But essentially, photosynthesis is a process that only plants or green producers can do. And they take sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide from the air, and they produce their own food. So we obviously are not like this. We can't just go lie down in the sun and never have to eat again. We are not autotrophs. We must consume our food. So basically anything that does not have to eat, they make their own stuff, their own nutrients, they are autotrophs or producers. So heterotrophs. So the other term that heterotrophs can go by is a consumer. So producers are autotrophs, consumers are heterotrophs. So these are organisms that cannot make their own food, so they must ingest it. So depending on what they are ingesting, consumers can be in any trophic level except trophic level number 1. So trophic level number 1 is only for producers. Every other trophic level involves consumers. Now, which one that it belongs to will depend on the ecosystem. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Okay, so heterotrophs. There are different types of heterotrophs that exist, and their classification really goes by what do they consume or what types of things do they have to eat in order to survive. Okay, so omnivore, and I'm sure you've heard of most of these terms, but we'll go over them. So an omnivore is an organism that eats both plant and animal material. Okay, so for example, bears, right? So bears can eat fruits and nuts, but they also eat small living things as well. So fish, deer, maybe rabbits. We are omnivores as humans. So meaning this is not necessarily what you choose to eat, but what you actually can eat. Okay, so what I mean by that is a person might decide that they are a vegetarian, so they may choose to only eat plants. But technically, the human anatomy, like the human body, is built to be an omnivore. So meaning, even though you're choosing only to eat plants, your body, your stomach, your mouth, your teeth, the way that your body is essentially organized is in order to be able to eat both of these. Okay, so what I mean by that is when we talk about herbivores, for example, herbivore bodies are only built to eat plants. They literally cannot eat any sort of animal. They can't eat, animal meat or animal products. Like their body literally cannot digest it. So like our bodies are built for digesting both. Obviously, you can choose to eat only plants or maybe only animal products, but that's a personal choice. The human body and the human anatomy is an omnivore. Okay, so carnivore. So carnivore is a species that only eats other animal products or meat for the most part. So for example, lions are carnivores. So what I mean by that, if you remember, it's based on the anatomy of that species. So like lions, if they wanted to eat a salad, they literally cannot. Their teeth don't have any they don't have any molars to grind up the plant cartilage, right? Or I should say the collagen that's inside of plants. And their stomachs actually cannot digest plants. So if a lion wanted to, munch on a salad, it actually would probably just throw it up because its body is not built for that. It's saying that there's something in there that it cannot digest. So it's kind of crazy to think about. So same thing with herbivores. So a herbivore is a species that only eats plants, meaning not just that it wants to eat only plants, but its body is built to eat plants. So for example, cows or rabbits or squirrels. So what I mean by plants is plant materials. That's nuts, berries, fruits, anything that is not another animal. So herbivores, same thing. Their bodies are built to eat plants. So they have molars, right? They don't have any of the sharp teeth to tear at flesh. They have flat teeth that are used for grinding grass and hay and different grains. And their stomachs are built to digest plant products. So if a cow wanted to eat, I won't say a burger itself, but I mean, let's say a cow wanted to eat, an egg. A cow's body is not built to digest the proteins that are inside of eggs or other animal products. So again, it'd probably just throw it up if you tried to force that. Another type of heterotroph or consumer is a scavenger. Okay, so a scavenger is a little bit different from a carnivore in that it eats dead animals. Okay, so carnivores typically eat animals that are still living, right? So they will hunt its prey, right? So think of the lion. A scavenger is something that will eat something that is already dead. So usually scavengers actually match up with carnivores pretty well. So if you've ever watched The Lion King, I'm sure you have lots of time now if you would like to watch it. It's a great movie. But The Lion King shows that there are, of course, lions, but there's also hyenas. Hyenas always follow very closely to where lion packs are. And that's because after the lion is done with the carcass, the hyena is a scavenger and will basically come in and eat whatever meat is left on the bones that are left behind after the lions are done with them. Vultures are another example of a scavenger. So vultures will eat basically anything that is dead. And actually the vulture anatomy is built to eat even things that have started to decompose. So the smell of something decomposing that would smell really gross to us, like you wouldn't want to touch it, is actually, it smells like delicious, and the vulture just wants to eat everything in sight if something is rotting. So the rotting smell to them, the way that their bodies are built is, that's a very pleasant odor, so that attracts them. And lastly, we have the decomposers. Okay, so decomposers, we're going to talk about them a lot in this unit. Decomposers are essentially very different from scavengers. Okay, so scavengers are carnivores that eat dead carcasses. Okay, but a decomposer is not a scavenger. They break down all dead organisms, both plant and animal organisms. So essentially, think of like a compost, right? So in the soil, so most decomposers are found in the soil. They're made up mostly of bacteria, maggots, worms. Usually when we think of decomposers, I tend to think of these two, like bacteria and like earthworms. Because if you're thinking about a compost, and let's say you put in like eggshells and banana peels and a whole bunch of leftover material, what will happen is the bacteria and worms that are in the soil will eat those things, like banana peels or the apple core, and essentially the poop that comes out after they eat that, the poop is very rich in nutrients. So that's their critical role, is that they complete the circle of living things. So they return the nutrients back into the soil. So meaning the plants that are going to grow in that soil can now use those nutrients to grow and to essentially go back into the food chain. So it's very important that decomposers actually are not part of food chains. They actually are, they're kind of on the outside, but they help the food chains and food webs to survive because of the nutrients that are in the soil for the producers to use. Okay, so food chain. So we looked at food chains in the last lesson. So food chains can be very short, or they can be very long. It essentially depends on what type of ecosystem that you're referring to. So it's a step-by-step sequence of who eats who in an ecosystem. So here, Sasad, I have it's like a little animated thing. There's like a fly that comes in and the frog eats this fly. So in this food chain, the insect is being eaten by the frog. So remember the direction of the arrow. I mentioned this before, but the direction of the arrow shows who is eating who in that little food chain. So the frog is eating the insect. So when we show this in a food chain, the arrow is pointing from the insect to the frog. So meaning the frog is eating the insect. Now, technically, this food chain is incorrect. Food chains must always start with a producer or an autotroph. So maybe this insect eats grass. Okay, so for this to be a proper chain, it should show a producer being in the first slot. And then, of course, so grass is eaten by the insect insect is being eaten by the frog. So this is more of a proper food chain. Okay, but what's important here is knowing which direction the arrows are in.